I'd like to welcome everybody to this panel, Truth, Lies, and Bullshit, Reflections on Contemporary Political Discourse. From the Philosophy Department, I'm Tony Roy, and with me are Professors Chris Matikia and Matthew Davidson. So the plan is to begin, as philosophers are prone to do, with some concept analysis. We'll talk about truth, lies, and bullshit. Then we'll turn to some examples of lies, bullshit, and, time permitting, some examples applying the concept of truth. Then we'll end with an open-ended period for discussion. So it's my task to start with the section on concept analysis. I should mention that almost everything I will say is controversial. There will be room to disagree, to argue about it, and maybe we'll be doing some of that at the end. It would certainly be possible to devote a whole course to talking about truth. So what we say will, of necessity, be brief, but hopefully we can lay down some basic concepts that will help us to make progress. So, truth. Here we have two very simple sentences. On the top, there's the dot in this box, and it's referring to this box. On the bottom, there's a dot in this box, and it's referring to this box. One of those sentences is true, and one is false. Which one is true? The first, right, it's not a trick question, right? We're not, I know that you think philosophers are like that, but we're not worried about imperfections on the screen or anything like that, right? So in just some straightforward way, the top one is true, right? And the bottom one is false. So why? Why is the top one true and not the bottom one? There's no dot in the second box. So a natural proposal is this, that a statement is true if and only if it correctly represents the world. So this first statement is true. Well, why? Because it correctly represents the situation. And a statement is false if and only if it misrepresents the world. So again, the second statement is false because it's wrong. It misrepresents the situation. I should mention that when a philosopher talks about concept analysis, we have some concept that we're interested in, and then we have a condition. And the idea is that if the condition holds, what we'd like to do is generate a condition such that if the condition holds, then the concept applies. But going the other way, if the concept applies, then the condition holds. So the equation holds in both directions. So this is supposed to be an analysis of truth and falsity, and we can generate some consequences. So consequence number one, not every expression is true or false. So we have expressions that correctly represent the world. They're true. We have expressions that statements that misrepresent the world. They're false. But there's another class of expressions that actually don't represent the world. They don't represent the world as being some way at all. I'm thinking perhaps of questions. Is it raining? Exclamations. You say, go Coyotes. Or if we're into football right now, you know, go Falcons or something like that. These things don't describe the world as being one way or another, and so they're not really candidates for truth and falsity. Second consequence, truth is not the same thing as proof. So we have the same analysis, the same statement is true if and only if it correctly represents the world. And ordinarily we use proof or evidence to help us determine or discover what is true. But the discovery is not the same thing as the truth. Just as, for example, a star is not, or a planet, let's say a distant planet, is not the same thing as the discovery that there's a distant planet, right? The planet is itself, and then you discover that it's there. So in the same way, there's truth, there's the statements correctly representing the world, and then there's something separate, there's the process of discovery by which we determine that a thing is true. So here's a simple little case. We have a bunch of people with blindfolds, a dog, and a statement. There's a dog in the room. The statement is true. Well, why? Because it correctly represents the situation. And it's true even though these people don't have reason to believe it. Consequence number 3. There is no true for you, true for me, and false for you. So especially in controversial contexts, say religious discussions, increasingly in discussions of politics, one will hear something along these lines, that something or another is true for me and false for you. But again, on our account, a statement is true if it correctly represents the world. And what people think about it won't change whether or not it correctly represents the world. So you're not going to be able to generate true for me and false for you. And here's our situation again. Everything is the same except we have a little guy back here that doesn't have a blindfold. And the statement, there's a dog in the room, it's still true because it correctly represents the world, but we have here a situation where maybe different people have different beliefs, different people have different reasons for beliefs, but the beliefs and the reasons don't affect whether or not the statement correctly represents the world, and so therefore whether or not the statement is true. Okay, so there's a quick and dirty sort of picture of what it is for a sentence to be true and what it is for a sentence to be false. Now, falsity is sort of essential to what it is to be a lie. So lies are false, but not every false statement is a lie. So we have true statements, we have false statements, and we have the lies included in the false statements. Can anybody think of a time when you said something false, but it wasn't a lie?
Just a mistake?
What?
You're just mistaken?
Yeah, you're just mistaken, right? So you say something, somebody give me a concrete example. Something you said.
I'll take this from Dr. Davidson's class.
Okay.
He said, if you see somebody standing in the corner drinking a martini, they're not actually drinking a martini, they're drinking water, for example. You say that person is drinking a martini, although he's not drinking a martini.
Yeah, okay, so what you said is false, but you think it's true, right? And it's because you think it's true, it's not really a lie. So we have here a statement is a lie, if and only if it's false, and the speaker accepts it's false. So you don't think it's true. And we have to actually accommodate another kind of circumstance. So there's where the speaker intends for it to be accepted as true. So there's a class of statements, say stories, sarcasm, jokes, where you say something false, you know it's false, but you don't really mean for anyone to believe it. So, you know, student walks into class 20 minutes late, I'm grumpy, and I say, well, you're right on time. Okay. So now what I said may be rude, but it's not a lie. Well, what I said is false. It's definitely false. You're not on time. I know it's false, but I don't intend for anyone to accept what I said is true. Same thing, you're telling a joke, 3 men walked into a bar, and maybe you know full well that 3 men didn't walk into the bar, so it's false, you know it's false, but you don't really expect anyone to believe you when you say 3 men walked into the bar. So some consequences. First, true statements are not lies. So we've built our account of a lie. On this account, you have to say something false. The second one, innocent mistakes are not lies. So in this case, the speaker says something false, but she thinks it's true. And also, fiction, sarcasm, and jokes are not lies. In this case, the speaker can say something false, recognizing that it's false, but doesn't intend for it to be accepted as true.
What if it's false? The speaker accepts that it's false. The speaker doesn't really care whether or not you believe it is true, but as an act of dominance, the speaker wants you to say that it's true.
Yeah, that's good. I considered changing, the statement of that last condition with something like this. The statement warrants that it is true, or the speaker warrants that it is true. So they're giving their authority to it, and that sort of removes a worry about whether we're going to, what we want to happen with the other person. Yeah. So that might be a stronger way to develop our account of a lie. Good. Very good. It turns out that truth, falsity, and lies, there's a long tradition in philosophy of trying to think about these notions. But discussion of bullshit really only took off with the 2005 publication, this little book by Harry Frankfurt, who's a Princeton philosopher, titled On Bullshit. So bullshit, like a lie, so bullshit, first of all, we have kind of a crude image here with this term, but it's actually an interesting and important concept. So bullshit involves a kind of misrepresentation. So in that respect, it's like a lie, but the misrepresentation is generalized, so that, or the type of misrepresentation is generalized so that bullshit applies to a wider range of contexts than lies. So we have this proposal. A thing is bullshit if and only if its original nature or purpose does not properly align with its purported nature and purpose. So there's some kind of a mismatch between what the thing is purported to be, what it's supposed to be, and what it is. I think we can develop and understand this a little better, perhaps with some examples, or consequences. So here, a first consequence. From this account, we can explain why not all bullshit is verbal. So first, you can have a bullshit task. Can anyone think of something that you were asked or required to do and you thought, this is bullshit? I just want an example. Okay, go.
Clean up a kid's throw up while I'm at work.
Clean up a kid's throw up at work while you're at work. Well, okay, so and what made it bullshit? It was, what made it bullshit?
Well, it was not part of my job description. We have someone to do that.
Right. Okay. So you're things are supposed to be one way, but they didn't turn out to be that way, right? And so then you say this is bullshit. Okay. Perhaps a bullshit action. Now I'm thinking here of I'm trying for a non-verbal action. So can someone think of something that someone does, that people do or has done, something that people do that would count as bullshit?
So when a soccer player gets really close to hitting someone else's shin, but the other person just rolls on their back and starts wailing in pain.
Exactly. So the flop, right? So the flop. So it's purported to be the case that they've been viciously fouled and knocked to the ground, but in reality they just dove down, right? So bullshit action. You can also have a bullshit object. Here, maybe you're watching late night TV. You see an advertisement for a miracle product. It slices, it dices. It's only $19.95. You're all excited, so you call in. Then it turns out that shipping and handling is $50. And and when you get it, it's just some plastic cutlery or something. So that's bullshit. Right? Okay. So even though we have bullshit that's not verbal, surely, so consequence number 2, surely the classic form for bullshit is verbal. Now there's a lot of things you can be doing with speech, right, with verbal communication, but surely among the default purposes are to say things that are relevant, well-grounded, and true. So we end up with some varieties of bullshit. Notice that lies still qualify. So a lie purports to be one thing. It purports to be the truth, but in reality, it's not. You come into my office, you're explaining to me why you didn't do your homework. You say, oh, my dog ate my homework. And then right after that, my grandfather died. When my grandfather died, my mother had a heart attack, and I was busy, attending funerals and going to the hospital, and so I couldn't do my homework. All right. Well, first of all, maybe it's true, but but no, right? It's a lie. What you're saying is false. You know it's false, but you're hoping that I'll take it, that I'll accept it as true. And it's bullshit, right? But there are other sorts of ways to engage in verbal bullshit. Obscurantism. The example I'm sort of thinking of is, you're at you have a political debate. The candidate is asked a question. The candidate says many things, but none of them are relevant to the question. So that's bullshit. Right? Another sort of case that may be more relevant, there's the bullshit exam. You're taking an exam, it's an essay exam, you really don't know the answer. But you're still writing down some stuff, right? So you purport to be answering the question, but you're not. So the professor's looking at it thinking, that's bullshit. Okay. Inadequate attention to truth. This is actually the category that Frankfurt, in his little book, is especially concerned with. So here you have statements. Well, let me just, again, an example. Maybe bragging comes in here. You're at a party, there's a band, it's not very good, and you turn to your friend and you say, I'm the best guitarist in this room. But unknown to you, Eric Clapton is sitting in the back, drinking a beer or something. So you purport to be saying something that's grounded in such a way that we should believe it, but actually it's not. You don't have any idea who's in the room. It's worth observing, so lies, right? Lies are bullshit, and we've said that lies are false, but with the other two categories, you can have things that are either true or false. The candidate may give an obscure answer by saying things that are false, but they may also say some stuff that's true. It's bullshit, not because it's false, but because it doesn't answer the question. Same thing with inadequate attention to the truth. Maybe when you give inadequate attention to the truth, you say something false, but it's also possible that by accident, as it were, you end up saying something true. So maybe you really are the best guitar player in the room. So consequence 3, lies are a species of bullshit, but bullshit cuts across the other categories. So again, we have lies included in false statement and also included in bullshit, but we have both bullshit in each of the other areas. We might think again of the bullshit exam. And here we have Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes, which is by far my favorite comic, as anyone who looks outside my office door will see. But anyway, Calvin's taking a test, and he says, oh good, a true or false test. At last, some clarity. Every sentence is either pure, sweet truth, or a vile, contemptible lie. One or the other, nothing in between. Now he looks at the test, and we see him flipping a coin. All right. So presumably, some of Calvin's answers are true, some of them are false, but it remains bullshit because he purports to be giving serious answers when he's not. It's worth maybe noting that Calvin seems to be confused about the concept of a lie. When the teacher writes false statements on the exam, presumably the teacher doesn't intend for anyone to accept them as true. And so it's not actually a contemptible lie. But anyway. But okay, so we have true, we have bullshit in the true and in the false category. But here's Calvin again, taking a test. Question number 1, explain Newton's first law of motion in your own words. And he gets a great idea. And he writes down, Yaka Food Mog, Grug, Pugawup, Zink, Watum, Gazook, Tumble Spuzz. And he says, I love loopholes. Okay, so he hasn't actually said anything that's true or false, but it's still bullshit because he purports to be answering a question that he's not answering. Okay, so there we have it. True statements correctly represent the world. False statements misrepresent the world. Lies are a species of false statement, and bullshit it involves a sort of misrepresentation, but it can fall into any of the other categories. So with this said, we'll turn to some real life examples. I'm kind of sweating.
So I am to present some examples of lies. So I've been tasked with finding 2 lies told by the major party presidential elections during the last election. First I thought, well, this is going to be easy. But it's actually not completely straightforward, as you might expect a philosopher to say. So there's a general epistemic problem here. That is a problem having to do with knowledge and how we know things. So recall the definition of lying. A statement is a lie if and only if it's false, the speaker accepts that it is false, and the speaker intends for it to be accepted as true. It's this third part that's difficult. It's fairly straightforward to ascertain if a claim is true or not. Sorry, fake news. It may also be straightforward to ascertain that the speaker intends what they say to be accepted as true. But how can we ascertain that a speaker accepts the truth of the claim? Perhaps the speaker is ignorant. Or perhaps the speaker has convinced himself that what he is saying is true. In the following, I'll give examples of what I take to be lies. If you want to be a stickler here, you could insist that they should only be taken to be some variety of bullshit involving some falsehood or other, and not lies. I'm fine with either. In the proceeding, I will assume acceptance of the falsehood of the claims on the part of the speaker. It's worth noting first, though, that the 2 major candidates were not equally prone to telling lies. According to PolitiFact, 26% of Clinton's evaluated statements were mostly false, or pants on fire. This is the same percentage as President Obama, and a smaller percentage than Speaker Paul Ryan, 42%, and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, 45%. According to PolitiFact, 70% of Trump's statements were mostly false, or pants on fire. Yet Trump consistently was viewed as more trustworthy and honest than was Clinton. He had an 8% lead in this metric, 46% to 38%, just before the election. This strikes me as, at best, a media failure of epic proportions. With that proviso, here's a lie from Trump. Trump says, "You won't hear this from the media. We have the highest murder rate in this country in 45 years. You don't hear that from these people. They don't want to talk about it. The highest murder rate in the United States in 45 years. He made this claim about the crime rate several times, 1028, 1029, 1030. This claim is false. According to FBI stats, the murder rate in 1971 was 8.6 per 100,000 people. The murder rate in 2015 was 4.9 per 100,000 people. It's worth noting the public perception doesn't track reality in this regard. In spite of the fact that violent crime rates have plummeted, people don't realize that this is the case. So here's the violent crime rates. You can see them spiking around 1990. We're not sure why they spiked and why they've fallen. It's not clear. Some people think it might have to do with exposure to lead and taking lead out of gasoline, but it's not clear. Here you can see the perception of crime. This is the percentage of people saying that there is more crime in the US than a year ago, and then you can see the falling of violent crimes. A lie from Clinton. In Iowa, on 4/13, she said, "I think if we were just to go around this room, there are a lot of immigrant stories. All my grandparents, came over here. My grandfather went to work in a lace mill in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and worked there until he retired at 65. But census records and war draft cards show that 3 of her 4 grandparents were born in the US. 7 of her 8 great-grandparents were immigrants, though. It's not as though this was made up out of whole cloth. Her grandparents were impacted by the fact that their parents were immigrants.
All right, it seems like I drew the short straw. I get to talk to you about bullshit, or maybe I volunteered for it, who knows. In the interest of time, I've just chosen 2 examples of bullshit from the recent political campaigns, And let me just tell you that there was an embarrassment of riches. All right, so it was very easy to find 2 examples. But what I wanted to do was to give you an example first of false bullshit that does not involve a lie. Right? And so many of you may remember this tweet from Donald Trump. He tweeted at one point, I guess it was November 27th, just a couple weeks after the election, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. Let's take a look at this claim, right? He won the popular vote, he claims. But he claims that on a condition that if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. So he seems to be suggesting that he accepts the view that millions of people voted illegally because he seems to be offering an argument of sorts that goes something like this. Millions of people voted illegally. If millions voted illegally, I won the popular vote. So therefore, I won the popular vote. And it's this first claim here, millions voted illegally, that I want to propose as an example of false bullshit. That's not a lie. Okay. All right, so here's the statement. Millions voted illegal. It's false because it doesn't accurately represent the world, right? If you remember Professor Roy's original slides, he said that statement's true if and only if it correctly represents the world, and it's false if and only if it misrepresents the world. This misrepresents the world. Not only is there no evidence, and evidence is different from truth, but anybody who's examined this question thoroughly is of the opinion that it's false. All right? The statement millions voted illegal is not a lie, though, because Trump apparently believes it. He accepts it as true, right? He doesn't accept it as false while intending for others to accept it as true. Instead, Trump just mistakenly believes that it's true. You mistakenly believe something that's true, then what you're stating is a falsehood, not a lie. Any question?
How do you know that he mistakenly believes that it's true and that he's not purposely lying?
That's a fair question, and this goes to the point that Professor Davidson was making during his presentation. That I can't get into Trump's head, right? We can't lift up his scalp, right, and go into his brain and verify this. So you're right about that. But I just toss it out to any observer here that he's probably accepting that it's true that millions voted illegally.
To say it's not bullshit, so still.
Well, if he accepts it as false, right, but intends for others to accept it as true, then it would be a lie, and then it would count as a false lie bullshit. But I think the more plausible interpretation is that he does accept it as true, and so it's an example of a false non-lie bullshit. All right? So yet in suggesting millions voted illegally, Trump appears to be bullshitting us. Why? Well, because the statement's original nature or purpose, which is insufficient or fake attention to truth, does not properly align with its purported nature, and that's to communicate what is true. Another way of putting this is to take the condition that Professor Roy placed on his slide, that an example, one type of bullshit is inadequate or insufficient attention to truth, and I like to reformulate that as reckless disregard for truth. This is an example of someone who's just being in reckless disregard of the truth and is just uttering anything. And that's why it qualifies as bullshit. It's reckless disregard for the truth. All right? So there you have it. Millions voted illegally. There he is, and there's the little emoji that I was able to dig up online. All right? First example. All right. Second example, and then we'll just open it up to questions. All right. I want to give you an example of true bullshit. And so I think you may remember this press conference. Let's see if I can get this to work.
The race, nobody even talked about it. It's a very terrible thing. Yeah.
Actually, a question, sir. Thank you, Mr. President-elect. On that intelligence report, the second part of their conclusion was that Vladimir Putin ordered it because he aspired to help you in the election. Do you accept that part of the finding? And will you undo what President Obama did to punish the Russians for this, or will you keep it in place?
If Putin likes Donald Trump, I consider that an asset, not a liability. Because we have a horrible relationship with Russia. Russia can help us fight ISIS, which, by the way, is number one tricky. I mean, if you look, this administration created ISIS by leaving at the wrong time. The void was created, ISIS was formed. If Putin likes Donald Trump, guess what, folks? That's called an asset, not a liability. Now, I don't know that I'm going to get along with Vladimir Putin. I hope I do, but there's a good chance I won't. And if I don't, do you honestly believe that Hillary would be tougher on Putin?
Okay, this is great. This is a great example of bullshit, and it's a great example of true bullshit, and I'll explain why in just a second. Here's the question, okay? I've transcribed the question from the reporter. Thank you, Mr. President. In case you can't see it from back there, on that intelligence report, the second part of their conclusion was that Vladimir Putin ordered it because he aspired to help you in the election. Question 1, do you accept that part of the finding? Question 2, and will you undo what President Obama did to punish the Russians for this, or will you keep it in place? What was his response? Well, if Putin likes Donald Trump, I consider that an asset, not a liability. All right? Now, why does this qualify as bullshit? Let's take a look at this. First, the statement, I consider the possibility that Putin likes me an asset, not a liability, is true as long as we assume that Trump is speaking sincerely, right? We're trying to, as long as he's speaking sincerely, if he's sincere in saying, I consider this an asset, then it's true if he considers that an asset. So, in other words, it correctly represents the world, in this case, the world consisting in his state of mind, right? True statement. I consider it an asset. However, he's also bullshitting the press because, again, to take Professor Roy's analysis of bullshit, its original nature or end, which is to duck the questions posed, does not properly align with its purported nature or end, which is to address those questions. Let's take a look again at those questions, right? To say, as your answer, I consider the possibility that Putin likes me an asset, not a liability, answers neither of the reporter's questions, right? Do you accept the finding that Putin was trying to help Trump win the election? Doesn't answer that question. Nor does it answer the question, will you undo what President Obama did to punish the Russians for this, or will you keep it in place? Again, referring back to Professor Roy's slides, what Trump is doing here is a version of obscurantism, right? He's not giving information that's relevant to answering either one of the two questions. What he wants to do is he wants to duck the questions. What he's offering up is a decoy, hoping that we won't notice that he's not answering the questions. And that's what qualifies it as bullshit. If Putin likes Donald Trump, I consider that an asset, not a liability. There you got it. Bullshit number 2. And now I'll turn this back to Professor Roy.
We have, let me just take a couple minutes. So we talked about truth, lies, and bullshit. We had some examples of lies, examples of bullshit. Let's just quickly have some examples where we apply the concept of truth. This sort of thing has been all over the news lately. And the first one is a little vignette from the Diane Raimes Show, which is a talk show on NPR. And besides the moderator, the two people talking are Glenn Thrush, who's a correspondent for Politico, and Scottie Nell Hughes, who was Trump spokesperson and contributor to CNN, and so forth. And they're actually talking about Trump's claim that millions of people voted illegally. Now, Professor Natikia has suggested that that claim is false, but we can, for the moment, we're just going to set that aside and think about the way the notion of truth is being used. So here's the
of
clip.
an opinion, and that's, on one hand, I hear half the media saying that these
So
are
this
lies.
is Hughes.
But on the other half, there are many people that go, no, it's true. And so one thing that has been interesting this entire campaign season to watch is that people that say facts are facts, they're not really facts. Everybody has a way, it's kind of like looking at ratings or looking at a glass of half full water. Everybody has a way of interpreting them to be the truth or not true. There's no such thing, unfortunately, more of fact. And so Mr. Trump's tweet amongst a certain crowd, a large a large part of the population are truth. When he says that millions of people illegally voted, he has some facts amongst him and his supporters, and people believe they have facts to back that up. Those that do not like Mr. Trump, they say that those are lies, and there's no facts to back it up.
All right, let's go to Glenn Thrush and let him comment.
Job off the floor here. There are no objective facts. I mean, that is an absolutely outrageous assertion. Of course there are facts. There is no one.
Okay, so we have, let me get back to the slide. So we have Hughes making this statement here. She says, there's no such thing, unfortunately, anymore of facts. And so Mr. Trump's tweet, amongst a certain crowd, a large portion of the part of the population, are truth. It's worth noting that first, that Hughes actually is saying two different things here. First, she says there's no such thing, unfortunately, anymore of facts. So she seems to be denying the existence of facts or truth. And then she says Mr. Trump's tweet, among a certain crowd, a large part of the population, are truth. So here she seems to be saying that there are truths or facts, although they are different for different portions of the population. These are different claims, and they're not consistent, right? So if there are no facts, or if there are no facts or truths, then there aren't any facts or truths, even different ones for different people. But either way, there seems to be a misapplication or a misunderstanding about facts and truth. So, of course, it may be that we don't have any more agreement about the facts. And it may very well be that different groups of people, large groups of people, disagree about the facts. But if the statement in this case, millions of people voted illegally, if it correctly represents the world, then it's true, and that's the fact, right? If it misrepresents the world, then it's false, and the fact is that it's not the case that millions of people voted illegally. So either way, first of all, the facts don't disappear, right? We have facts. And second of all, the facts don't vary. They don't go back and forth for different portions of the population. So this is the second statement anyway, is a true for you but not for me statement, which I've argued doesn't make sense given our account of truth. Very closely related to this, this is from just this last weekend, thing that got a lot of press. We're on Meet the Press. The moderator is Chuck Todd, and he had on Kellyanne Conway, who was Trump's campaign manager and is now a counselor to the president. And they're discussing Trump made some claims about the size of the crowd at the inauguration, and then those claims were supported or repeated by Sean Spicer, who is the press secretary. And that's where this conversation starts, if I can find the mouse. So
I put him out there for the very first time in front of that podium to utter a provable falsehood. It's a small thing, but the first time he confronts the public, it's a falsehood.
Chuck, I mean, we're going to keep referring to our press secretary in those types of terms. I think that we're going to have to rethink our relationship here.
It undermines the credibility of the entire White House press office on day one.
Don't be so overly dramatic about it, Chuck. You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains that there's
alternative facts, 4 of the 5 facts he uttered. The one thing he got right was Zeke Miller, 4 of the 5 facts he uttered were just not true. Look, alternative facts are not facts. They're falsehoods.
okay, so in this case we have Conway. She makes this claim. You're saying that is the claim that is the biggest crowd ever, is false, and they're giving, that is Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. Well, once again, right, we can have, there can be contrasting beliefs about what the facts are, about what's true, but we want to think about, again, what it is for the sentence to be true. So it's the biggest crowd ever, right? That's true if it correctly represents the way things are. It's false. And if it does correctly represent the way things are, then that's the fact. And if it misrepresents the way things are, then it's false. And the fact is that it wasn't the biggest crowd ever. But either way, what we don't get are contrasting, that is conflicting alternative sets of facts, right? It's either one or the other. And further, it's not the case that saying something very forcefully or having a lot of people say it makes something a fact, right? So the fact is, just depends on whether it was the biggest crowd ever or not. Okay. Are there questions or things people want to say?
If we don't have a concrete definition of truth anymore, which is where it seems like it's going with alternative facts, how can we have a discussion?
Yeah, well, I want to say we do have a concrete account of truth, and that people who say we don't are confused. Right.
It's misrepresented. Obviously, I think this concept is ridiculous. There is no such thing as alternative facts.
Right.
But obviously, people had the belief also that Trump was a better representative of the truth than Clinton, although the facts showed that her statements were more often true than his, right? So there's this misrepresentation somehow.
Yeah, I think you guys just say something if you want to. I think that what you're pointing out is right. So we made we gave an account of the truth, right? Something is true if and only if it correctly represents the world. But then there's a separate and very difficult problem about how you decide what's true. I'm teaching right now, there's some of the people in here in my class titled Theory of Knowledge. And there are many, there's controversy about how we can figure out which things are true. And so there do seem to be deep problems about discovering the truth. But we want to separate those problems from being problems about there being truth. So I'm not quite sure how well I'm answering your question.
Can there be a statement that's bullshit and then later it turns out, well, it wasn't bullshit? Or is it forever going to stay bullshit?
Do you have an example in mind?
I can do one.
Okay.
So,
yeah, but that's all that comes out of your mouth, right? So, yeah. Yeah.
Today Trump tweeted that he would be looking into executive orders to find these millions of votes. So if potentially it happens that the investigation occurs and it happens that exists, the bullshit, which I would agree is currently bullshit, would become no longer. He's saying this without facts, but if the investigation occurs, Protect the Vote actually tweeted today that they're conducting the 16th month investigation into voter fraud of the 2016 election. If those things happen, would that be an instance of what is currently bullshit turning into, or is it because he doesn't know it for sure right away?
Yeah, do you want to ask?
Yeah. Yeah, well, at the time the statement was made, or the tweet was made, the original tweet, right, it was still tweeted with reckless disregard for the truth, all right? And so for that reason, it would still continue to qualify as bullshit, even if it should turn out later that there's this investigation and it turns out that he's right, let's say, hypothetically. Still at the time that the tweet was made, it still qualifies as bullshit because at that point it was made with reckless disregard.
Yeah, so on the Venn diagram, it would fall into the bullshit that's on the truth side.
Exactly. So there may be, what would happen is, it would still be bullshit, but there's, we would have to switch our evaluation of it from true bullshit to, or from false bullshit to true bullshit. Right. Go ahead.
Hey, so I have a comment about Matt's presentation and his graphic. Actually, you get right on it, Matt, to blame the media. To blame the media, but never followed up. But that chart, I want to say something about the chart about violence, right? You know, I'm sure you're pretty aware of Jordan Gruber's great studies on violence, on screen violence, right? One of the things that found is that there's a correlation between there's a difference between heavy viewers and light viewers, right? So heavy viewers, people who watch X number of hours of TV per week, are more likely to think the world is more violent than it really is, right? And lighter viewers are more likely to perceive the world as truer to the statistics that you showed, right? We can compare statistical analysis of violence in real life, and we can see media representations of violence. So so his findings were, it's not a simplistic correlation between, screen violence, I'm going to do violence. It's like the more you watch, the more violent you think the world is. When it's not, the more likely you think a police officer pulls a gun, the more people are in court than they really are. All those things get skewed. He called it cultivation hypothesis or cultivation theory, right? So it's true that those misperceptions he correlated those to heavy viewers versus light viewers, right? So, and now who knows what it would be heavy media users, the way perceptions are shaped by the new digital onslaught. I mean, who knows now, right? So it's not, well, it's just a comment, but it's just like, it's not, of course, if the more media you are exposed to, the more likely you are to think the world is more violent, the more likely you are to put up with the police state activities to be safe. So, but anyway.
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple thoughts on that. So, I don't watch a whole lot of local news, but when I do turn it on, I think if I watched a lot of this, I would never leave my house because there's crime everywhere, and everyone's being shot and mugged, and it's terrifying. But I know the stats tell me that actually crime is down substantially from say when I was a kid. It is a much safer country to be in. Second, a general comment about the media. I think the media has this a priori commitment to both parties being roughly the same. So both sides do it, and with two candidates like Trump and Clinton, they aren't both the same, right? One is more truthful than the other. One is more radical than the other in terms of where they stand relative to their party's general political preferences. And I think outlets like CNN and New York Times and NPR really failed us. I think they really failed us by attempting to give the conception that Trump and Clinton they're both pretty much the same, relatively similar candidates. Clinton is a mainstream Democrat, and Trump is really radically different than anything that we've seen before in the United States.
Okay, other questions? Go ahead.
This idea that if you say something enough times, it will become true, even if it wasn't to begin with. If you look at the history of that idea, it seems to me that you used to hear that kind of rhetoric more from the left than from the right. But now it seems that you hear it more from the right than from the left, as in the examples that have been given here. Any ideas about how that shift happened, what caused it? Or am I wrong in perceiving that there was such a shift?
Asking what caused it.
It's striking that say 10 or 15 years ago, it was the right that was concerned about postmodernism and the lack of truth and all the things that were going on in humanities departments. But the right seems very postmodern right now. Very, very unconcerned with truth and facts and reality. And I don't know why that happened. I mean, I guess it's about seizing power. I don't really have a good explanation as to why that happened. But it is striking how postmodernism has moved from the left to the right.
Well,
if
and
I-
also from academia into the popular culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I may speculate too, I mean, it just seems to be a matter of the right taking what they perceive to be the left's playbook, so to speak, and just running it against the left. So,
The worst part of it.
right. So what they do is, when someone accuses you of something, a natural tendency in self-defense is to accuse the accuser of the same thing you've been accused of, and that's essentially what they're doing.
Yasha?
I respectfully disagree with you, Matt. If you take a look at the campaign of Barry Goldwater, for whom the major losing feature was a small child with a thermonuclear detonation or nuclear detonation behind her,
That was aired once, but go ahead.
including our dear new president who has stated, we have nuclear weapons, why not use them? At that time, there was a wonderful book called None Dare Call It Treason. If you've never heard of it, you should look it up. It was circulated widely, and it was precisely full of non-facts, very much so. So the playbook isn't new. It goes back earlier than that. The NSDAP had exactly the same methodologies, which they may or may not have copied from Stalin and Lenin. The playbook is not new, and they've merely taken what's things like in None Dare Call It Treason. You should read that. It is a very interesting book. It was produced by primarily an entity called the John Birch Society, if you've ever heard of it. And it is very similar to what the alt-right and most of the Trumpites actually support and believe. The perceptions, not necessarily the facts. And it's very easy to manipulate the perceptions. In this election now, if they get the various Republican attorneys general who use voter suppression techniques to come up with the statistics, I'm sure they'll find 3 million illegal votes, except they're going to be in the red states, which were already went to Mr. Trump.
Yeah,
that
strikes me as plausible and actually not inconsistent with what I said. I mean, that strikes me as correct. So, yeah, thanks.
Other comments? Go for it.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sorry.
was it me?
Yeah, it was, but then I saw a hand in front of you. But so go ahead. You go first. Go ahead.
Okay.
You start.
So I listened to Dr. Davidson's point, and I think it's getting harder and harder to find a nonpartisan news source. So for instance, like PolitiFact is owned by a newspaper that endorsed Clinton in 2015, even before Bernie dropped out of the race. So a lot of people would read maybe what PolitiFact said and say, oh, when Hillary Clinton said I had no classified documents on my server, true, and it finds out later that it wasn't true, like there definitely were at the time classified documents, like people might lose distrust in those things. And so I was wondering how do you find that middle ground? Do you go far to the right and read Breitbart and Fox News, and then read far to the left and read Jezebel, Huffington Post, and that stuff, and then hope that you find the middle? Or is there something that you truly think is accurate? Because I would say that 75+% of the journalists did support Hillary Clinton pretty vocally. And so did they not try to let her win? Or like, did they not do their best? Like where was the failure occurring? And how do we find that middle ground?
Let me just say something in response to that. I think at least one thing to say is that we're all responsible to identify the truth. And the way to go about that is to examine the reasons, examine the basis. Now, if all you read are opinion columns, you're probably not going to get any facts, or there'll be very few facts available to you. But I think we are, at least as university students, capable of reading the newspaper and finding out where we have unsupported claims and what we don't. So I guess I would I would not advocate reading whack jobs on both sides and hoping that somehow it merges to be the truth. What I would advocate is finding the evidence.
So what would you say is a non-editorialized news source?
If you read the editorial page of the New York Times, you're going to get editorials. But there are many factual claims that it's reasonable to think are silly, right? I don't know. Nothing there. Yeah, go ahead.
In a linguistic approach to truth and false,
Since words do change over time, and the meaning of words do change over time, how does that match up with how close we can get to truth and to false? Because, for example, if you say that that person murdered that person, murdered has connotations behind it, and obviously the actual dictionary meaning of murdered, but if that person actually did kill that person, is it actually murdering the person?
Right, I'll give a super simple example of what I think you're saying, and then you can tell me no if this is what I was trying to say. So look, there's something about what I said. I said if a statement correctly represents the world, it's true, and if it doesn't, then it's not true. But there's room for a certain clarification of this thesis. So consider the claim, I'm hungry. Suppose I say, I'm hungry. It turns out this is false because I just ate a big lunch. But you say, I'm hungry. It's completely true because you didn't eat lunch and you're just waiting for us to end so you can rush out and get dinner. Okay, well, so this sentence, I am hungry, right? When it comes out of my mouth, I'm saying one thing. I'm saying that Roy is hungry. But when it comes out of your mouth, you're saying something else, saying that you are hungry. So we can use the exact same words to say different things. So sometimes a philosopher will try to pin down, well, the thing that's true or false is what you said, right? So it's either true or false that I'm hungry. And if it's false, then it's false for everybody that Roy is hungry. And it's either true or false, right, that you're hungry. And if it's true, if it's true that you're hungry, then it's true for everybody that you're hungry. But so the point is that words can be used to say different things, right, with different meanings. And so then the response to this is that you have to focus on what the words say. So let's suppose one person, so it's possible to use the exact same words to say different things, and then truth or falsity don't actually apply to the words, but they apply to what you said.
Okay, and how do we know that you are actually, in fact, that your statement is actually false or true, unless you tell us that it is or not?
Well, that's, I had a subjective case, but suppose I had said something more objective, like I have a phone in my pocket, then they could, yay, okay, it's true. But you're right. Again, we're now back to the question of how we figure out what's true.
So if we have the truth and we're deciphering what it is, what do we do about it? What's the action we take? Because if we know it's true and nothing's done, then what's the point of knowing it's true in the first place?
Are we talking about just an ordinary truth or true bullshit?
I'm just purely because you brought it into the political context.
Yeah.
So if we have all this stuff that's being proven that Donald has said that's not true, what's the point of knowing it's not true, or what actions do we take then? Because if we know it's not true and we just leave it alone, then isn't that condoning it?
Okay, that's a fair question. I mean, the majority of this presentation is devoted to just labeling statements as either true or false, lies or non-lies, bullshit or not bullshit, right? And then it's a further question, what you do once you identify a statement as one of these, okay? So, I mean, really, the action the most basic action that's required is just believing correctly, right? So if we identify a statement as true, that's a reason for believing it, all right? And not for disbelieving it. And if we identify, but on the other hand, if we find an instance of true bullshit, right, then we could still believe in the truth of the statement, but what we should do is we should find some ways of counteracting the bullshit. So if the bullshitter, to take the case that we had up on the slide, is one of obscurantism, right, where someone is uttering truths but not addressing a fair question that's posed and the public has an interest in hearing an answer to, right, then the response should be to redirect, to say, hey, Mr. President, you're bullshitting us. could you please answer the question? Right? Say something relevant. Right? So, you know, it may be true that it's true that you consider Putin's liking you an asset. Okay, good. I register that. I add that to my mental furniture, and it's a belief that I add to my stock of beliefs. But there's this further question about what to do about the bullshit aspect of that truth.
Another thing that we might say here is just that it used to be that political candidates were punished for saying things that were false and for uttering bullshit. But somehow or another, there seems to be some kind of a shift. And that is where the candidates are not, or certain candidates anyway, were not being punished for things that would have sort of ruled them out previously. And part of this may be related to conceptual slippage of the sort we're talking about. So people have no, I mean, I think what's really going on is that people don't know who to trust, right? So there's disagreement about what the facts are, but this is now being sort of mushed together with claims that there are no facts and so forth. So one thing we can do is just try to get straight, get ourselves conceptually straight, so that we can really identify what's at issue.
Do you think, well, with this election, we kind of saw a new way to win, it would just be entertaining, I would say. Do you think we're in danger of, like, the next election, anything coming out in the future, it's just going to come down to who can entertain or get, like, entertaining topics? Who can like who can bullshit the most? Like Trump, half of the stuff he was saying about Hillary, of course, wasn't true, but he got that idea out there. So what he got was like people talking about it, and the more people you have talking about it, the easier it is to forget about the truth and just focus on entertaining. So do you think it's just gonna continue to get worse after this one?
Can I say something?
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, John.
Just the idea that this is completely new. I mean, it's kind of off the charts in how far it is with Trump. But I mean, one thing that's coming up in my head now with what we're talking about is WMD and selling the war, the Iraq War. You had something similar. I mean, that's a whole trying to figure out if that's bullshit or lies or where that falls on the spectrum. But it did seem to be part of the strategy to sell the war, was just to get all these people talking about the threat of Saddam Hussein. So I guess the point would be, I guess the new thing, the only thing I just want to say is there's something new about how extreme it is, but it also, there has been parts of it already in the past in American history.
Yeah, the best example of that was John Wayne's motion picture about the Vietnam, before it was the Vietnam War, Vietnam conflict, and everything looked wonderful and legitimate for why people had to go into the Vietnam conflict. It was not a war. We've not been at war since World War II, of course. But the facts of the matter were that what you saw in the John Wayne movie and when you saw the analysis were utter, I believe the phrase you use is bullshit, including what they advertised as the time, the so-called domino theory. So it's not the first war we did it that way.
Well, yeah, we actually have had a war that was declared. That was Afghanistan, but it was declared by
Congress
Congress.
declared war.
Yeah.
Congress assembled.
Yep. So I am concerned about things going forward, Alexis, and one reason why is because, as Professor Roy says, it looks as though there is no longer any penalty for blatant lying and total bullshitting in a way that there used to be. And I think part of this is because a number of people in Congress think that they can control Trump and use him for their own purposes. And I think that some of it is because the media is really concerned with, as I said before, with making it seem as though both candidates are sort of equally problematic. So Trump would do something that was sui generis, right? Something that the like of which we hadn't seen before, and then you would give equal time to Hillary's email scandal or whatever, right? And then if I weren't consuming a lot of news, I would, if I just casually consume news, I would think, well, really both candidates are really terrible and sort of equally so, right? But that is just an artifact of of the way the media decided to cover things. Yeah, so I'm concerned about things going forward. I'm concerned about the norms concerning truth and bullshit having been broken so blatantly by Donald Trump in this election that he has shown a way to grab power by completely disregarding our democratic norms, and I don't know what that means going forward.
That may have been the result of this election, is that most people were willing to accept truth and bullshit over lies and bullshit, because Hillary has been caught in a lie. And I'm sure Trump has been caught in many lies, but he still holds to his truth. So would you say that that's what gives most people pause to want to vote for Trump? Because I've heard that everyone says he's such a straight shooter, and he's, at least you know what he's saying because he's speaking his mind, even though his truths are bullshit.
So I've actually thought about just this point. So there are two claims that are run together here. Trump speaks his mind, and Trump tells the truth. I believe Trump speaks his mind. I mean, I'm not certain. It could be that that this person that he's putting forward doesn't reflect the true Donald Trump. He's actually, a compassionate, decent, cosmopolitan, lover of diverse America. I suspect probably not. I suspect probably not. But I think Donald Trump probably does say what's on his mind. That is not equivalent to saying, and I'm not saying that you said this, but I've heard these two run together. That is not equivalent to saying that Donald Trump is a straight shooter and that he tells the truth. No, he lies all the time, right? About everything, about stuff he doesn't even need to lie about. And he speaks his mind, right? Both of those are true.
If I can add something, I think we've begun to see some evidence that perhaps there is a bullshit penalty. I'm not sure about this, and I'm not sure if it's going to last long enough. But many papers have been reporting that the level of Trump's support has gone down since he's been elected, right? So most presidents pick up support, or if their approval ratings go up between the time that they're elected and the time that they're inaugurated. And Trump has reversed this trend, right? He's, I think, the single example in I don't know how many years of someone who's reversed this trend. And that may be evidence, I'm only speculating now, that may be evidence that he's paying a penalty for repeatedly bullshitting the press in particular, and through the press, citizens. And I'm hopeful that if that trend continues, then we'll have Mike Pence as president.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I think his approval rating's going down just because we don't have Hillary's problems to focus on as well as his. I think now that we have solely focused on him, even my friend, I have a friend in the Army that was super pro-Trump, and he was saying, oh, Trump deserves to be. And then the other day I woke up and he sent me a text message because he's in New York. And he said, dude, I woke up scared for the first time today, realizing that Trump is actually our president. And I'm like, isn't that what you wanted? And he said, no, I don't know why, but I just woke up scared and I couldn't believe it. And I'm like, well, that's what you get. So I'm thinking it's just that now that people can focus on Trump, I think they're starting to figure out more about him.
Yeah. One thing we should say is that we're philosophers and not really political scientists. So you guys started asking us questions about reality, and philosophers are much better about the theory of the thing. I mean, we care about reality, right? But we're interested citizens along with everybody else. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been fun.